Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samach Zayin, Daf 67 of Masechta Pesachim. Now, I think it's kind of an interesting Daf today, but I can't really say for sure. It talks about different kind of Tumahs, but not in the super technical sense, in the like, where do they have to hang out kind of sense, right? Are they kicked out entirely from the Jewish community? Are they only restricted from going to maybe the Beis HaMikdash or different parts of the community? So that's going to be a big part of today's daf. We're going to start out continuing on our discussion from yesterday at the end about Pesach sheni. That how do we know that individuals do Pesach sheni, but not communities? So let us remember what we were talking about at the end yesterday. So at the end we saw a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding this question, that how do we know that when it comes to Pesach sheni, what's Pesach sheni? Pesach sheni is if you have fellows who were impure, or they were traveling, they were away, and they were unable to offer the Korban Pesach on the 14th day of Nisan. So 1 month later, there's a second chance. There's a Pesach sheni, and they can offer their Korban Pesach then. And the thing is, Pesach sheni is allowed for individuals, right? Individuals, 1 month later, if they couldn't bring it on the regular time, so they offer it a month later. But the entire community, if the majority of the community was impure, so then they would not offer the Pesach sheni. Rather, they would just bring it at the regular time, being impure, and that would be okay if the majority of Am Yisrael is impure. Fine. Now, how do we know that? So Rabbi Yochanan learned that out from the pasuk of Ish. What does the pasuk say? Was it Ish ki atame v'derech rechoka, whatever it is. So it says individuals. Right, so from Rabbi Yochanan learns out that it means individuals bring Pesach sheni, but communities, if you have the majority of the community tameh, they would not bring Pesach sheni. What would they do? They would offer it Pesach Rishon. They would offer it just the regular time when they're tameh. Reish Lakish says, no, that pasuk, I wouldn't know that the community offers the Pesach at its regular time. Rather, what I would say from that pasuk is, yeah, sure, individuals bring a Pesach sheni, but if the majority of the community was tameh, they wouldn't bring the Korban Pesach whatsoever. So how do I know that if the majority of the community is tameh, they would bring the Pesach Rishon b'Tumah? So because the pasuk says, "Vishalchu min hamachane kol tzara v'chol zav v'chol tameh lenefesh," so that in the context of Tumah it says you have to throw out of the camp anybody with tzaras, anybody who's a zav, and anybody who's tamei meis. So the question is, why does it have to list all three of those things for being thrown out of the camp? Just tell me tamei meis, which is the most lenient of those three tumas listed, and I know that if a tamei meis has to be thrown out of the camp, so then memele also zav and a mitzora need to be thrown out of the camp as well. To which Reish Lakish answers, the reason why we make these distinctions is because there must be a situation where a tamei meis actually is allowed in the camp, and only a zav and a mitzora have to be thrown out. And if we would only say tamei meis in the pasuk, well then I would think that in the case where tamei meis is allowed in the camp, well, so are a mitzora and a zav. But that's not the case. And what is this situation where tamei meis is allowed but not a zav and a mitzora? Says Reish Lakish, it must be when the majority of Am Yisrael is tameh. In that case, if they're tamei meis, if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei meis, so then they could offer the Pesach sheni even at its regular proper time, but that would not apply to zavs and mitzoras. That is why the pasuk makes the distinction, right, or lists specifically tamei meis, mitzora, and zav for a situation where tamei meis would actually be allowed in the camp, but zav and mitzora would not be allowed in the camp. That's talking about when the majority of Am Yisrael is tameh, they bring the Korban Pesach at its proper time. But that would not apply to if the majority of Am Yisrael was zavs or mitzoras. Okay. Now, Fine. So that is how Rish Lakish learns out that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, they bring the Pesach Rishon. Now you might be thinking, well, according to Rish Lakish, the reason that we learn this out is because, right, the reason why the Pasuk needs to say Tmei Meis and Zav and Mitzorah is because there might be times when the Tmei Meis is allowed in the camp, but a Mitzorah and a Zav are not. But then why doesn't the Pasuk just say Tmei Meis and Zav? And Memele, I know that since Mitzorah is more Chomer than Zav, that a Mitzorah is not allowed in the camp. Right? So meaning if you would say Tmei Meis, and you can't just say Tmei Meis because there are times when Tmei Meis is allowed in the camp. Okay, so say Zav as well. And then even in a case where Tmei Meis is not allowed, Tmei Meis is allowed in the camp, such as Pesach sheni, Abba Tumah. Well, a Zav nonetheless is not allowed in the camp. And then Memele, if I know a Zav is not allowed in the camp, then Mitzorah is not allowed in the camp because the Mitzorah is more Chomer. How come it has to list Mitzorah also? So if you're thinking that question, that's Abaye's Kasha. And we're going to start with Abaye's Kasha on Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph, 3 lines into the page. Amar Abaye, Yihachi Lema Nami. Well, Rish Lakish, if you're correct, that you learn out that if, right, the Pesach Abba B'Tumah, that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, that they could bring the Korban Pesach, and you learn it out from the pasuk that says, from that list, Tmei Meis and Zav and Mitzorah, and you're saying that it should be enough only to have Tmei Meis. The fact that it says Zav and Mitzorah means that there must be a situation where Tmei Meis is allowed in the camp, and that must be Pesach Abba B'Tumah. That must be when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh. But if that's the case, Yihachi Lema Nami, let us also say Yomar Zav u'Tmei Meisim. So then just saying the pasuk Zav and Tmei Meis, Yomar Mitzorah, and don't say anything about a Mitzorah, Vani Omer, and I'll say Zav Mishtaleach Mitzorah lo kol sheken. Well, if a Zav has to be thrown out of the camp, well then certainly a Mitzorah is going to have to be thrown out of the camp. So Eli yesh chashash Mitzorayin mishtalchen vein Zav Tmei Meis mishtalchen. So rather, Abaye suggests, sort of not seriously, but sort of as a question, well then let's say that when it comes to Pesach Abba B'Tumah, that if they're Tmei Meisim, they could remain in the camp, and also if they're Zavim, they could remain in the camp, and only a Mitzorah is thrown out of the camp, and that's why we have to list Tmei Meis and Zav and Mitzorah, because there might be situations where a Tmei Meis and a Zav are actually allowed in the camp, and a Mitzorah will nonetheless have to be thrown out of the camp. Ve'ez is a Pesach Abba B'Tumah, and therefore Abaye suggests, sort of as a question, well then let's say that Pesach Abba B'Tumah, it's not just Tmei Meisim that can bring the Korban Pesach if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, but even Zavim. And if you're going to say, okay, sure, that sounds good to me. It says Tmei Meisim, Zavim, Mitzoraim, because in a situation where we have Pesach Abba B'Tumah, where the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, so then Zavin and Tmei Meisim could bring the Korban Pesach, but not Mitzoras. V'atnam, but we learn in a Mishnah, Pesach Abba B'Tumah, lo yochlu mimenu Zavim v'Zavos nidos v'yaldos v'machlu p'turin. But we have a Mishnah that says that if you have a Pesach that was offered B'Tumah, right, the majority of Am Yisrael was Tameh, so they offered the Korban Pesach B'Tumah. Lo yochlu mimenu Zavim v'Zavos, Zavs and Zavos are not allowed to eat this Korban Pesach. Nidos v'yaldos, also a woman who's a Nida, or a woman who gave birth, and I don't know if that means, I guess probably means the entire 80 or 40 days that she has not yet brought a Korbanos Mistama, because she hasn't yet brought a Korbanos, so I assume that I assume that she has the status of a Tvulas Yom Aruch. I assume that a Tvul Yom cannot eat the Korban Pesach. That was the whole thing about Mechusar Kippurim that we were talking about the other day. I assume that that's Pshat. But if they ate the Korban Pesach, then they're Pater. So what do we see? So we see that a Zav is unable to eat Korban Pesach even when it's brought B'Tumah. So therefore Abaye has problems with Reish Lakish's approach, right? Because Reish Lakish learns it out from this pasuk of Vishalchu min hamachne kozav v'chotzurav v'chotam lenefesh. Kotzurav v'chozav v'chotam lenefesh. So Reish Lakish wants to learn out from the fact that it lists all three. It must be that Pesach haba b'tumah, right? That when the majority of Am Yisrael is tameh, they can even bring the Korban Pesach when they're tameh on the 14th day of Nisan. And the reason why I had to list all three is because there might be situations where Tmei Meis is allowed, i.e. Pesach haba b'tumah. But Abai says, based on that logic, I would then also include Zavs to say that when the Korban Pesach, when the majority of Am Yisrael is tameh, and they bring the Korban Pesach at its proper time, that even a Zav could partake. But the Mishnah says that a Zav cannot partake. So, therefore, Reish Lakish's approach, says Abaye, is going to come up short. El Amar Abaye L'olam Mikra Kama. So rather Abaye says, no, really, let's learn it out from Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk of Ish, right? What does that pasuk say? What's the pasuk? Pasuk Yud. Daber b'nei Yisrael lemor ish ki yetamei lo nefesh o v'derech chok lachem o darseichem b'asa Pesach Lashem. Right, so it says in the context of Pesach Sheni that ish, an individual who is tameh, can do Pesach Sheni. Okay, fine. Very good. Now, the question that we had on that, Reish Lakish's question was, well, I'll say that, sure, individuals do Pesach Sheni, but if the community was majority tameh, they wouldn't bring the Pesach at all. That was Reish Lakish's question. But says Abai, it's not really a good question. Imkain, if that was the case, that the implication is that if the majority of Am Yisrael was tameh, they wouldn't bring the Korban Pesach at all. Well then, Nichtov Rachmana ish ki tameh. Then the pasuk should simply say, if an individual is tameh, la nefesh la mali. What do we learn out la nefesh? La nefesh is referring to Tumah Sames. So why is the pasuk specifying by Pesach Sheni Tumah Sames? What about Tumah Sames? So if you want to suggest, what we're talking about over there with Tmei Meis is that when we're talking about an individual who offers Pesach Sheni, so that is a Tmei Meis. That if you have a fellow who touched a corpse, so then he won't offer the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, he'll offer it 1 month later. But if you have a fellow who was a Zav or a Metzora, he would not be able to bring Korban Pesach. Maybe that is what, meaning he wouldn't be able to bring Korban Pesach nor Pesach Sheni. Maybe that's what we're learning out from La Nefesh. But we learn in a Brayso, we learn in a Brayso, is it possible that the only people who could do Pesach Sheni is a Tmei Meis or somebody who was away? How do I know that? No, even a Zav or a Metzora or a Bo'al Nida. A Bo'al Nida is a man who sleeps with a Nida. He has the same Tumah as she has. I think that there's one nafkamina, if I remember. I think it might be Mishkav Umoshav, I think is the only nafkamina. Anyways, so if you have a man who sleeps with a Nida, so he becomes tameh for 7 days. So how do we know that a Zav, a Metzora, Bo'al Nidos, how do I know that they can also bring the Pesach Sheni? Tamalomar ish. Therefore it says ish, any individual. Okay, so we see that when it comes to Pesach Sheni, any individual can bring Pesach Sheni. So whether you were a Tmei Meis, a Zav, Metzora, makes no difference. So, La Nefesh Tuchas Rachman Alamali. So then again, why does it say La Nefesh in the context of Pesach Sheni? What are we learning out about it? So Ella, Hachika Amar, what it's saying is Ish Nidche Le Pesach Sheni, Ve'en Tzibur Nidche Le Pesach Sheni, Ella Avde Betuma. Rather, what it's saying is that an individual does Pesach Sheni, but a community, if the majority of the community is Tameh, they do not offer the Pesach Sheni, V'chi Avde Tzibur Betuma. Right, rather they just bring the Korban Pesach when they are Tameh. And what Tumah are we talking about when we say that an individual does Pesach Sheni? And that includes Tmei Mesim, Zavim, Metzoraim, everything. But at Tzibur, if they were majority Tameh, they would offer the Pesach Sheni. what kind of tumah are we talking about that they would offer the Pesach sheni? La nefesh, tumah sames. That if you have a community that is tmei meis, they offer korban Pesach, bitumah, but that wouldn't apply to zavs and mitzoras. Okay, there you go. So Abaye kind of brings our proof to support Rabbi Yochanan that it comes from ish. Amar Rav Chizda. So now Rav Chizda says, Mitzora shenichnas lefnimi michitzaso pater. Shneimar badad yeshiv mechutz lamachne moshavo hakasov nisko le'esei. Okay, so it says Rav Chizda, Mitzora shenichnas lefnimi michitzaso. So a Mitzora who came into an area where he's not allowed to be. So a Mitzora needs to, right, a fellow with saras, I guess the assumption is he spoke Lashon Hara, and he got leprosy, so he's got to be thrown out of mamash everywhere. He's not allowed in the community bichlal. He has to go outside of the city and hang out over there. So Rav Chizda says, Rav Chizda Mitzora shenichnas lefnimi michitzaso, if a Mitzora came inside of the city, even though he's not allowed to, pater, we don't whip him. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, badad yeshiv mechutz lamachne moshavo, that he needs to remain alone outside of the camp. Hakasov nisko le'esei, the pasuk kind of flips it into a mitzvah saseh. So as Rashi points out, even though there's a pasuk that says lo yitamos machneim, there's a lav, a lo saseh associated with being a mitzora, that lo yitamos machneim, that they should not be mitame their camp. So I might think that if you come into the camp as a mitzora, you'll be chayev malchus. So therefore the pasuk says badad yeshiv mechutz lamachne moshavo, that he's got to remain outside. The pasuk kind of makes it into a mitzvah aseh to say that you're not going to be chayiv malchus for it. Eisvei. But we have a kasha on Rav Chizda. Mitzora shenichnas lefnim michitzaso barboy. If you have a mitzora who comes in to the city, so he's going to be chayiv malchus. Zav v'zava shenichnasu lefnim michitzaso barboy. If you have a zav or a zava who goes where they shouldn't go. Now, a zav and a zava, they're allowed in the city, they're just not allowed into the machne leviyah. Right? And as Rashi points out, machne leviyah, and the second wide line of Rashi called harabayis chutz l'chomas azara. All of harabayis outside of the azara is machne leviyah, and inside of the azara would be machne shechina. So there's different distinctions, and we're going to be discussing these distinctions for the rest of the page, but throughout the rest of the page. So a mitzora needs to be thrown out of the entire city, entire Jerusalem. A zav and a zava are allowed in the city, but they cannot go on harabayis. A tmei meis is allowed on harabayis, is allowed in the machne leviyah, but not in the machne shechina, not inside the azar. So if a zav or a mitzora, if a zav or a zava goes into the city, goes into the harabayis, where they're not allowed to go, so then barboim, they get malchus. Utmei meis muti likanis machne leviyah, but a tmei meis, somebody who's tummy from a corpse, is allowed to go into machne leviyah onto harabayis. V'lo tmei meis b'vad amru el afilu meis atzmo, and it's not just somebody who's tummy, not just somebody who touched a corpse, but even a corpse itself is allowed in machne leviyah on harabayis. Shenemar, as the pasuk says by Moshe, veikach Moshe satzmus Yosef imo, that when the Yidden left Egypt, Moshe Rabbeinu took the bones of Yosef HaTzadik with him. Imo b'mechitzaso, and that means even with him, Moshe was a Levi, so even with him, where he was in the machne leviyah, he was allowed to have the bones of Yosef with him over there. Okay, fine. So what do we see? So we see that taka, if a mitzora comes into the city, he's chayiv malchus. So if Chizda says that if a mitzora comes into the city, he's pater, but we have a brayso that says if a mitzora comes into the city, he's chayiv. So now, here's the thing. Rav Chizda bases his premise on the fact that it says badad yeshev michutz lamachne moshavo. That from the fact that it says badad yeshev, that he has a directive, a positive directive to sit outside. So Rav Chizda wants to say that this positive directive converts the lo sa'aseh of lo yitamos machneim into a mitzvah sa'aseh in terms of punishment, and he will not be chayev malchus. Fine. So now, that works if you could say that badad yeshev mechutz l'machane moshavo is available for that, right? We're not learning anything else from it. So we could say it's available to teach that you're not chayiv malchus if you're a Mitzorah who comes into the city. So, but if that pasuk is not available for that, well then you'll be chayiv malchus from lo yitamos machneim. And we're going to see right now that it's machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about, do we learn something out from that pasuk specifically or not? And if the answer is no, well then we can learn it to teach that you'll be pater from malchus. So, Tanoi, so the Gemara says it's machlokas Tanoim detanya, as we learn in a brisa. Badod yeshev. Oh, so immediately we see that we're learning something out from that pasuk. It says Badad yeshev, that this fellow who's a Mitzorah needs to sit alone. Levado yeshev, he's got to be alone. Shlo yehu tmei macherim yoshven imo, that there's no other tmeim that are there, meaning a zav, a tmei meis. They're not thrown out of the city. Only a Mitzorah. Badad yeshev. Only Mitzorahs sit there alone outside of the city. Tmei meis and zav will not be there. They'll be allowed in the city. Yachol yehu zavin v'tmei meisim mishtachin l'machne achas. Okay, fine. So now what about the zav and the tmei meis? Is it possible that they'll be restricted to the same area? So zav and tmei meis are allowed in Machne Yisrael, in Jerusalem, but just not in Machne Levia. Neither a zav nor tmei meis would be allowed on Har HaBayis. Is that possible? Tam Lomar, therefore the pasuk says v'leitamus machaneim, that they won't be mitame their camps, meaning their respective camps. Litin machne lazeh umachne lazeh divrei Yehuda, to say that they each get their own camp, i.e., a zav is restricted to Machne Yisrael. He's not allowed to go on Har HaBayis, whereas a tmei meis is allowed on Har HaBayis and Machne Levia, just not in Machne Shechina. Fine. Very good. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda learns out these distinctions of the camps of a Mitzorah being outside of the city, a Zav being within the city, and a Tmei Meis being restricted to Har HaBayis but not allowed in the Azar. So he learns this out from Badod Yeshev, from this pasuk. So therefore, it would not be available to learn out that you'd be pater from Malchus, like Rav Chizda is saying. However, Reb Shimon Omer, Eino tzarich. No, we don't need to learn it out from that pasuk of Badod Yeshev. Hareu Omer, the pasuk says, Vishalchu min hamachne, that you got to send out of the camp the following tmeim. Kol tzorah v'chozav v'chol tamei lenefesh. Anybody who's got tzaras, anybody who's got ziva, or anybody who's tmei meis. Yomar tmei meis, v'yomar tmei zav. So just like we suggested earlier, why don't you just say tmei meis? And then I know that, well, if a tmei meis needs to be thrown out of the camp, certainly a zav, which is more chamer, needs to be thrown out of the camp. Vani omer tmei meis mishtachin zav lo kol sheken. So lama nemar zav. So then how come it says zav? Shouldn't we just know that? Memele litin lo machne shnia. To give it its own distinction about where he has to be restricted to. V'yomar zav v'yomar mitzorah. Okay, so now, great. So just say zav. You don't need to say mitzorah. Vani omer zav mishtach mitzorah and lo kol sheken. And I'll say, well, if zavs have to be thrown out to some separate place, certainly mitzorahs have to be thrown there. So lo menemar mitzorah. How come it says mitzorah? Litin lo machne shlish is to say that a mitzorah even goes to his own camp. So there are three distinctions. That a tmei meis is going to be restricted to one area. A zav is going to be restricted to an even more restricted area. And mitzorah is going to be even more restricted, i.e. it's going to have to be thrown out of the entire city. So we learned that out from Vishalchu min hamachne kol tzarua v'chozav v'chol tamei lenefesh. Well, if that's the case, then what's with Badad Yeshev mechutz lamachne moshavo? So kshu omer Badad Yeshev akasuv nisko la'aseh. So what do we do from Badad Yeshev? It's to teach that we treat a mitzorah who comes into the city as an aseh, i.e. we don't whip him. Okay? Fine. So Rav Chizda is going to have to say, is going to be saying like Reb Shimon, who says that Badad Yeshev is available to teach us that a mitzorah who comes into the city is spared from Malchus. Fine. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to know. So Reb Shimon was just assuming that each thing was more chamer than the next, right? That Zav is more chamer than Tmei Meis, a Mitzora is more chamer than a zav. Fact the Gemara, my chumrei to zav mitmei meis. How do we know that a zav is more chamer than a tmei meis? Shekein tumah yotza olav migufo. Well, the tumah of a zav comes out of his own body, so therefore it must be more chamer than a tmei meis, which comes from a different body. But adrab tmei meis chamer, I'll say that somebody who touches a corpse is more stringent. Shekein ta'onazah shlishi v'shvi. Because a corpse, if somebody touches a corpse, so then you gotta have the mechatas on the third day. The 7th day, zav doesn't need that. You just gotta have 7 clean days, and then goes to the mikveh, and that's that. So Amar Kra Tameh v'chol Tameh. Okay, so the pasuk says Tameh, which means Tmei Meis, but also says v'chol Tameh. The Rabbos Tmei Sheretz, to include also somebody who touches a dead sheretz is not allowed in Machne Shechina. V'zav chamer mitmei sheretz, and we know that a zav is more chamer than a tmei sheretz, and therefore, since we're learning out from in the context of tmei meis, also tmei sheretz, and zav is more chamer than tmei sheretz, so memele zav is more chamer than tmei meis as well. Umay chumrei kidamar. Okay, but still, why are we assuming that zav is more chamer than tmei sheretz? Well, it's because a zav comes from his own body, whereas tmei sheretz doesn't. But adrab, sheretz chamer, I'll say that sheretz is actually more chamer shekem mitami ba'ones, because a sheretz, even if a dead sheretz falls on you and you didn't notice it, it was complete happenstance. It just fell on you, so you're still going to be tamei. Whereas a zav does not become a zav if he saw ziva be'onis. I don't know, Rashi suggests maybe somehow he was eating too much or something, and then somehow it became a zav. So, whatever it is, if a zav becomes a zav be'onis, somehow it just happened on its own, how else would it happen? I don't know. Anyways, a zav can't become a zav be'onis. So I can argue that sheretz is actually more chamer than zav, to the extent that you can become tummy from a sheretz be'ones, but not become a zav be'ones. Now, Amre, so the answer, ki agavna zav nami tamui mitame be'ones, ki darfuna dam rafuna v'yeh rishona shel zav mitame be'ones. Well, that's not actually true. Yeah, to become a zav and to have to wait like 7 days without seeing any ziva, yeah, that ones wouldn't apply, sure. But a zav who just sees ziva one time is treated like a balkari, and a balkari is tamei until the evening, which is basically the same thing as a sheretz. So basically, in terms of, yeah, sure, maybe to be an outright zav, it's not it's not bonus, but just to become a zav to the same extent that we're talking about in terms of Tumah sheretz, that which is Tumah till the evening, well, that applies to zav as well. If a zav sees ziva be'ones, he's also going to be tamei until the evening. So therefore, in that sense, sheretz, which you're tamei to the evening be'ones, and zav, which even be'ones you'll be tamei till the evening, is really the same. In which case, we could say that zav is more chamer than sheretz because it's migufo, it's from his body, and therefore, if zav is more tamei than sheretz, memele, it's also more tamei than tmei meis. Now, why are we assuming that a mitzora is more chamer than a zav? Ta'un priya ufrima v'asu b'tash mishamita. Because a mitzora, he has to grow out his hair, can't get a haircut, and he needs to rend his garments, and he can't sleep with his wife. So adrab, zav chamer. But I'll actually say that a zav is more chamer than a mitzora. Shekem mitami mishkav u'moshav, mitami klicheres beheset. A zav, let's say, is more chamer than a mitzora because anything that he sits on becomes an avatuma like him. That doesn't apply to mitzora. And any klicheres that he moves, if he moves it, it becomes tamei as well. So let's say that because of these reasons, a zav is more chamer than a mitzora. So makra zav v'chol zav. Well, the pasuk says in the context of zav, it also says v'chol zav. The Rabbos balkari. to include a Balkari as well. U'Mitzora Chamor Balkari, and a Mitzora is more Chamor than a Balkari, so Memele, it's also more Chamor than a Zav. Umay Chumre, Kidamorin. Well, what makes a Mitzora more Chamor than a Balkari? Well, as we said, Priya, Frima, Tashma Shamita, Adrabah, Balkari Chamor, Shekin Mitami B'Mashu. Well, let's say that a Balkari is Taka more Chamor than a Mitzora, because a Balkari is Mitami B'Mashu. If he sees even just like any amount of sperm, he becomes a Balkari. Whereas a Tsaras needs to at least be the size of a gris. It has to have a certain minimum size. So I can argue that Balkari is Taka more Chamor than Mitzora. Great. So, Reb Shimon holds like Reb Nosson, who says that actually by Balkari as well, there is a shear. That shear is, it has to basically fill up the tip of the penis, basically. So I guess if there's enough sperm that is that amount, so then you'll be a Balkari. So we see that a Balkari also has a certain shear, just like Mitzora has a certain shear, and therefore, so Balkari is not more Chamor than a Mitzora in that respect, and therefore we could say, well, a Mitzora has Priya, Frima, and Tashma Shamita, so therefore it's more Chamor than a Balkari. The Chacham don't agree with Reb Nosson, but Reb Shimon does hold like that. The Iskishle Balkari Zav, and the Balkari is compared to Zav, right? There's a pasuk that says, Zos tiatoras hazav asher teitzi mimenu shichva zera. So we see that Zav is compared to Balkari, and therefore a Mitzora is more Chamor than a Balkari, right? And since a Zav is compared to Balkari, that means that there's also a shear for a Zav, and therefore we will say that a Mitzora is more Chamor than a Balkari and a Zav. So there you have it. Mitzora is the most Chamor, then Zav is the next in line, and then Tmei Mes. Now, V'chol Tzarua L'amali, when it says V'chol Tzarua, so when it said V'chol Tameh, we learned that also Tmei Sheretz. When we said V'chol Zav, we learned that about Balkari. What do we learn out from V'chol Tzarua? So I did Chsiv Kol Zav, Chsiv Nami Kol Tzarua. We don't learn out anything from the V'chol. Rather, since it says V'chol Zav, it also says for consistency, for symmetry, it says V'chol Tzarua, but we don't actually learn out anything from V'chol. Okay, sounds good to me. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir Kam Reb Shimon. So now the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yehuda, Reb Shimon is saying good. Reb Shimon learns out the different camps for the Mitzora, Zav, and Tmei Mes respectively from the pasuk of. Right, so Reb Shimon learns it out from the pasuk of Vishalchu min hamachne Kol Tzorah v'chol Zav v'chol Tameh L'Nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda, why don't you learn it out from that pasuk? So Rabbi Yehuda Shapir Kam Reb Shimon, knew Reb Shimon saying good. Haumi Baile Nichdetanya. So Rabbi Yehuda will respond and say, no, we need Badod Yeshev M'chutz L'Machne Moshava to teach like in the following brisa. No, I'm sorry. We need Vishalchu min hamachne to teach like in the following brisa. Nichdetanya, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer says Rabbi Eliezer, Yachol Dachaku, Zavin Mitzorayin, V'nichnesu La'azara, B'Pesach haba b'Tumah Yachlu Chayavin. So if you have a Pesach haba b'Tumah, right, if you have the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mes, and they bring the Korban Pesach at its proper time, b'Tumah, and we said that only applies to the Tmei Mes, but Zavim Mitzorayin would not be allowed to partake. But let's say the Zavs and Mitzoras were very adamant, and they went into the Azara while Am Yisrael was offering their Pesach haba b'Tumah. Is it possible that they will be Chayiv Karis? Therefore, the pasuk says that you'll have to send out of the camp Mitzoras, Zavs, and Tmei Nefeshes, Tmei Mesim. B'shasha Tmei Mesim mishtalchin, Zavon Mitzoran mishtalchin, Ein Tmei Mesim mishtalchin, Ein Zavon Mitzoran mishtalchin. So, therefore, the pasuk says Vishalchu min hamachne Kol Tzorah v'chol Zav v'chol Tameh L'Nefesh, to say that when a Tmei Mes is not allowed to bring a Korban Pesach, so then certainly a Zav and a Mitzora are not allowed to bring a Korban Pesach. However, if a Tmei Mes is allowed to bring a korban Pesach, such as when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis. So then, if a Zav or Mitzora pushes their way in and brings a korban Pesach as well, they will not be Chayiv Kares. They're not allowed to do it milchatchila, but if they did it, they're not going to be Chayiv Kares. So that is what Rabbi Yehuda would learn out from Vishalchim and Amachane. So then how do you know that they have different camps that they have to be quarantining in? So therefore, the pasuk says Badad Yeshev Mechutz L'Machne Moshavo, and that limud that he had earlier. Okay. Omer Mar. So we said earlier, Zav v'chol Zav l'Rabbos Balkari. Okay. So we said that when it says v'chol Zav, it's to include a Balkari, that a Balkari needs to be thrown out of Machne Shechina and Machne Levia, and needs to hang out in Machne Yisrael, in the rest of Jerusalem. So this supports Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says two unrelated things. The first one, which is not important for us right now, is Mechilas Lo Niskadshu, which is that these little passageways that were underneath the Azara did not have the same holiness as the Azara itself. And the second thing that Rabbi Yochanan says, which is appropriate for our context, is Balkari is thrown out of two machnes, thrown out of Machne Shechina, Machne Levia. He's got to hang out in the rest of Jerusalem, just like Azav. Great. Meisvei, but now we have a question. Balkari kimaga sheretz, that a Balkari is like touching a sheretz. My lav l'machnosim. In what way is a Balkari like a sheretz? Mistama, it's to say that, well, just like a sheretz is thrown out of, right, Tmei sheretz is like Tmei Meis, it's thrown out of Machne Shechina, but is allowed in Machne Levia. So it seems like this Brisa is saying Balkari kimaga sheretz, that just like a sheretz is allowed in Machne Levia, so then also, right, a Tmei sheretz is allowed in Machne Levia. So I'll say that a Balkari is also allowed in Machne Levia, not like a Zav who's not allowed in Machne Levia. So the Gemara says, lo, the Tumah. No, it's for its Tumah. That just like a Tmei sheretz is tummy until the evening, so also a Balkari is tummy till the evening. But the Tumah, Hai Tumas Erev Ksiv Bei, Hai Tumas Erev Ksiv Bei. We already know explicitly, the Torah tells us what their Tumah is. The Torah says, Tmei sheretz is tummy till the evening, Balkari is tummy till the evening. So I don't need this Brisa to teach me that. I know it from the Torah. So in what way is the Brisa saying that Balkari is like Tumas sheretz? So Mistam, it's to say, in terms of the camps, that a Balkari is allowed in Machne Levia, just like Tmei Meis and Tmei Sheretz really are allowed in Machne Levia. Lo Tumasam. No, really it is talking about Tumas. Okay. But we already know that from the pasuk that they're both tummy until the evening. Balkamash Malon, the Balkari b'maga Sheretz, that Balkari kimaga Sheretz, Mamaga Sheretz, mitami ba'onis, Balkari mitami ba'onis. What it's saying is that a Balkari is like a Sheretz, kind of like we were talking about earlier, in that somebody becomes tummy from a dead Sheretz. It means even if it's ba'onis, even if somehow, I don't know, a dead Sheretz falls off of a tree and lands on your head, that sounds very unpleasant. But if that happens, so you will be tummy. And the same thing, if you somehow become a Balkari ba'onis, so then you also would be Tameh. Fine. Meisvei. So we have a question. Bo'al nida kitmei meis. Well, the Brisa then continues and says that a bo'al nida, a man who sleeps with a woman who's a nida. So kitmei meis. So a bo'al nida is like a tmei meis. Lemai. To what extent is he like a tmei meis? Ilema letumasam. Hai tumas shivak sivbei, vai tumas shivak sivbei. Well, if it's teaching that bo'al nida is like a tmei meis and that they're both tummy for 7 days, Pasuk already tells us that. We know that already. Se'elalav l'machnosam. Rather, it must be teaching about their camps. That just like a tmei meis is not allowed in Machne Shechina, but is allowed in the other camps. So the same thing applies to a bo'al nida. Umideseifa l'machnosam ave reishanami l'machnosam. So now the Gemara wants to say, well, if that's the case, that the Seifa by bo'al nida and tmei meis is talking about their camps, to say that a bo'al nida is not allowed in Machne Shechina, but is allowed in the other camps, just like tmei meis. So let's say the same thing by a Balkari and a Sheretz, that it's talking about the camps. So the Gemara says, Midi Irya, Hakadisa Valkadisa. To which the Gemara says, what? No, don't compare the Reish and the Seifa. Seifa is talking about camps, the Reish is talking about Tumah. Okay, well, there you go. That was Daf Samach Zayin, Masechet Pesachim. What do you guys think about Daf Samach Zayin? It was pretty good, right? I don't know. Gotta just keep your head around the distinctions, but it wasn't so confusing or complicated, I don't think. Anyways, so we started off discussing Pesach Sheni, that, with the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, but how do we know that an individual does Pesach Sheni but not a congregation? A congregation would just do Pesach Rishon, Betumah, if they were majority Tameh. Rabbi Yochanan learns it out from Ish. In the context of Pesach Sheni, individuals do Pesach Sheni, not communities. Rish Lakish says, yeah, but from that pasuk I would say communities don't do Pesach at all. So therefore he learns it out from the pasuk that says, Vishalchum min hamachne kol tzurov v'chozav v'chotami lanefesh. To say that, why do you have to list all three? Because it must be that there are situations where Tami lanefesh is actually allowed to stay in the camp. And that is Pesach Haba B'Tumah. So that's how we know that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, so then they do the Pesach at its proper time. So now Abaye had a kasha on that. He says, from that pasuk I can imply that even a Zav also is allowed to do Pesach B'Tumah, but that's not the case. So therefore he says, better to learn it out from Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk. And he answers the question that because it says Lanefesh, from Lanefesh, that's how it teaches that when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, but specifically Tameh Meis, they're allowed to do Pesach Bizmano. Okay. Then we discussed the different camps. Essentially we had a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda learns out that Mitzorah is thrown out of the entire Jerusalem. A Zav is thrown out of Machane, of Har Habayis essentially, but is allowed in the rest of Jerusalem. A Tmei Meis is not allowed in the Machane Shechina, is not allowed in the Azar, but he's allowed in the rest of Har Habayis. We said that Tmei Sheretz is like a Tmei Meis, Balkari is like a Zav, in terms of where they're thrown out of. And everyone agrees with these distinctions, seemingly. The difference is how they learn it out. Rabbi Yehuda learns it out from Bodad Yeshiv Muchutz L'Machne Moshavo. That's how he learns that the Mitzorah goes outside of the city, and then says Machanehem by Zav Mitzorah and Tmei Meis, to say that each one gets their own separate camp. And Rabbi Shimon learns it out from Vishalchum min hamachne kol tzorah v'chozav v'chotam lanefesh. Okay, and then we just really spent the rest of the daf trying to explain how do we know that this is more chomer than that. But alright, very good. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.